Welcome to Two Truths, where we explore controversial topics in religion, philosophy, and history from at least two different perspectives. I'm Dr. Darren Iammarino, and today we're going to be talking about Tantra versus Neo-Tantra. So this is sort of a topic that we'll see becomes kind of controversial in the 20th and 21st centuries. But it was also controversial even in the early days. The early days would be 6th to the 12th, probably, I'd say, or the heyday, if you will, centuries of the Common Era. That's when you see the rise of Tantra and it sort of proliferating, especially in like the 8th through the 10th centuries of the Common Era. Why did this happen? What exactly is it? We're going to get into all that, of course. I guess we could start by speculating on some reasons as to why this new set of practices and movement gains momentum. And part of the reason is going to be the fact on a political level that, you have kingdoms coming and going. In India, you have a lot of competing small states fighting against one another at times, a lot of death, a lot of war. So things to do with those emotions as well, like that might have been viewed as like negative emotions, anger, right? Dealing with anger, strife, right? Wrath, all of this, greed. These issues are going to become important. And the people that normally would be in charge of everything are going to be the Brahmins and the ruling class, sort of one tier below the Brahmins, who are the Vedic ritual specialists and high priests. But when you're in an era, an age of unrest and chaos, the Kali Yuga, it all of a sudden might make sense to flip the script, if you will, and look at those people who have been at the bottom, more of an outcast group, those who have seen death the most, right? Sickness, chaos the most, as guides towards liberation of some kind. Okay, so let's dive a little deeper now and get a definition for what Tantra is. There's very little agreement on how to define Tantra. However, I think the best we can do is look at some of the uses in the texts themselves, early days, when the term comes up. So to weave, like on a loom, basically, this is going to be a very old notion for how to define Tantra. And I think it's still good, as we'll see. The idea of like weaving, right, things together into a set of practices, which is another way to understand Tantra, that it's a set of ritual practices that are going to help lead to some form of freedom and liberation, weaving many parts together, right? A doctrine or a system of ideas, or the essence or main part of a doctrine or system. That's really what Tantra, in a more kind of literal sense, looking at the etymology, is about. When you take it way back in time, even into the Vedic period. So well before the 6th to the 12th century CE, when Tantra really becomes kind of its own thing, or a bunch of different things, a movement. I've talked about, in my yoga video, a group called the Shramanas, or Strivers, who have renounced the typical way of life, like being a householder, having a family, trying to get rich, and that type of pursuit. So a lot of people in India, going back a long time, but at least to the 6th century BCE, are basically giving up on the typical approach to life and heading out into the forest or just away from the town or city, right? We see the historical Buddha does this exact thing, right? He will leave completely a life of luxury to go to the forest and become one of these shramanas or strivers. And basically what they're doing out there is trying to seek some form of liberation and freedom, right? Now, how that's defined is going to depend upon which guru you have out there in the forest, okay? But the connection I want to make here is that two things. The shramanas are creating a lot of practices. And Tantra later on, right, was going to be using a lot of ritual techniques and practices. Some of them are these more like ascetic, yogic type practices that you get out of the period of the shramanas. Okay? Now there's also going to be a very erotic component, sensual component, as the other like main thread woven into Tantra. Okay? But right now, we're sort of trying to tie this connection here to these early forest-dwelling renouncers. Right? This even leads us to a notion commonly associated with Tantra of Sva-Tantra, or this is someone who's like self-liberated in many ways. They're their own master, I guess you could say, is one way to understand that. And in many ways, that's sort of what you're trying to achieve out in the forest. You might have a guru, but eventually you might not, like the Buddha's on his own, right? So there are solitary people out there as well who are trying to basically carve a path, right? That's different than what the cultural norms are of the time period. The question we now need to ask ourselves is like, well, what set of practices do you think you need to weave to discover a liberating form of truth? And now I think we need to like broaden a little bit. Okay? There's all these ascetic practices. I've mentioned those in the yoga video, and I will mention some again here in this one. But what's going to develop over time in India as well is sort of a reaction movement, I guess you could say, to this whole idea of abandoning life, right, and going out to the forest, that you can live a life as a householder or with a wife or, you know, in the city and still have liberation and meaning and purpose to your life, okay? So Tantra is going to definitely be something that you can do as sort of an average person. Now you'll need to get initiated into a group and all that, but you can be lower on the social hierarchy. This is not an elitist only thing for the Brahmin priests. Okay? You could be in the bottom of the caste system and all of a sudden not only be capable of being involved in this, but as I mentioned, 5 minutes ago, in some ways it almost could put you into like a privileged or revered status because you have in this like reversal of roles. If you're at the bottom, you're kind of in some ways looked at as a guide and on the top. If you're a female who formerly, right, you would have been not really involved in a lot of the stuff happening in the forest or yogic stuff, well, now you might be able to be viewed as critical as a consort or a guide in some manner, okay? But let's look at what the practices are, okay? The ritual techniques that are used. Number one, huge, mantras, okay? A mantra, like Om Namah Shivaya or something like this, Om as the simplest bija mantra or seed mantra, you basically have a sonic tool for the mind. If you were to kind of like break that word mantra apart. Another way to understand this, especially for Tantra, the mantras are going to relate to different goddesses or gods. And when you say them with repetition, it's basically it's the God manifesting or present, like full presence, in this auditory, like, form, sonic form. I guess you could maybe draw a parallel here. I wouldn't take it too far, but with like something like the Eucharist. So in a Catholic context, the Eucharist, properly understood, you're dealing with the full real presence of God there throughout that ritual process. With a mantra, in a sense, it's similar, where through the chanting of it, you're literally in the presence, right, of the wavelength energies of that God. Okay. Mantras, that's one. Lots of different ones, by the way, tons, more than we could go over. Mandalas, that means like a geometric complex, sometimes geometric patterns and shapes, sometimes simple, like it can mean a circle, but you might have like concentric circles with triangles in it. So there's something called the famous Sri Yantra diagram. The mandala could be a representation, like a map of a heavenly realm or space, or a paradise type realm. But it's a focus for concentration and meditation, and something to help train you so that you can then interiorize, if you will, that mandala, that map, into your mind's eye, and be able to recreate all the specific details of it through meditation, through like a form of visualization. So that's just a little bit with mandalas. Mudras are ritual gestures, body gestures, hand gestures. It can also mean like a seal, I guess you could say. Different, you might think about, doing like different things or whatever with your hands as simple examples to do with meditation. But there's also much more complicated mudras, especially related to sort of like yogic techniques. Right? So mudras, that's another piece. I'd say relating to mantras and mudras, you might want to bring in this other term, nyasa, which is like installing, depositing, I guess it might mean something like that, literally, where you're taking the mantra, when you say a certain aspect of a mantra, and touching, different parts of your body, where you're basically connecting that particular goddess or god, right, and mapping it onto your body, or your subtle body, at least, or visualized aspect of the god, sort of on you, above you, in front of you, depending again on the system. And that takes us to the next big piece of Tantra. Subtle body energies, chakras, kundalini, or this Shakti, female energy that's understood as being coiled as a serpent, kundalini, or kandali, that's coiled at like the base of your spine. And through certain breathing techniques and yogic techniques, you're going to open up a central channel that runs in front of the spine, that's you have to visualize, and you lift up this female energy to rise all the way up, and eventually connect at either the third eye or possibly at the crown of the head, depending upon the text. And this might release like nectar of Shiva, understood as like Shiva and Shakti, like as a male principle, like releasing Shiva's semen or something to like kind of like fill this body with this energy. That's going to be a big thing here. Visualized union, female energy with male energy, and literal union, as we'll see in a minute, where most people think about Tantra as sort of like a sacred, ritualized sex. All right? We're making our way to that. All right? Now, those are kind of the main, I'd say, techniques. There's a bunch of other things. You know, you go on pilgrimages and have certain ritual feasts. Initiation is critical, stuff like that, for Tantra. But, you know, there's not too much for me to say on that in a short video. And yogic techniques, again, we're kind of talking about some of those here, but you should also have some familiarity with breathing practices, different types, and meditation, samadhi, stuff like this. Have some basic, at least, familiarity with this stuff if you're going to get into the more advanced forms of what will be called completion stage Tantra, if we are in Tibetan Buddhism and Vajrayana Buddhism, which is a Tantric form of Buddhism, right? So let's stop there for a second and basically shift to what people really think this is about, and look at kind of like, all right, I've been talking about the history and classical Tantra in India mainly. The techniques will move into other countries and stuff, like eventually off into even Japan and whatnot. But what about this whole like dark, scary, mysterious stuff that always gets associated with Tantra? Where did that come from? And I think the easiest way to address that is to look at the difference between the left-hand path and the right-hand path of Tantra. You get this in the Western esoteric tradition as well, often, where the left-hand path is going to do stuff literally or more extreme forms of practices, and the right-hand path is going to be more of like a gentle, symbolic approach to things. Okay? So with Tantra, the left-hand path will require you to engage with antinomian behavior. That means against the law, against the established cultural norms of that time period. So for example, things that are like taboo: alcohol, eating meat, fish, pounded form of grains, sex. Those 5 are big. This whole, what do they call it? Pancha Tattva. It has other names and that they have. I can't remember. Pancha Makata or something like that, where you're dealing with these 5 potent substances because they're taboo, you see. They're known as the 5 M's because although I said like alcohol, meat, fish, grain, sex, if we were talking about in Sanskrit, these terms all start with an M. So that's why they're called the 5 M's. All right. The last of these 5 M's is going to be Maithuna, which will be understood in other parts of the world, like in Tibet. It'll be like Karma Mudra. It'll be discussed as, it means coupling, literally. this last of the 5 M's. Or karma mudra is going to mean action seal. It's sort of like a just euphemism or coded word, I guess, for like action seals, like 2 people in sexual union, okay? Coupling is pretty obvious, right? Same sort of thing. The question we really need to get into here for this video in trying to look at 2 truths is that, like, all right, here's the historical side, and it seems like they're trying to still experience liberation, but they're not trying to run away or escape from everyday aspects of life. Like, again, having a job, householder, having a family, being in society, all of that. The earlier forms were like escapist, more so, right? The Shramanas and Strivers, the Renouncers, they are pretty anti-body. I mean, radically against the body in many ways. They don't much care about it. It's an impediment to spiritual progress. Now with Tantra, the body is not an impediment. It's this whole idea of like rising by that which we fall. All right? So the poison that kills becomes the elixir of life in the hands of the wise. That type of thing of flipping it. If it was viewed as a problem that we needed to escape from, then let's use it as a vehicle for a more supercharged way to push through into liberation. See, that's what they're really doing here with Tantra as we move into these later centuries. Right? Yes, they are having sex as part of the ritual components to the system. A lot of the either like Indian Shaiva forms of Tantra are like Hindu Shaiva forms of Tantra are using sex, okay? But also the different Buddhist traditions are using it as well. The only group that's really not are like the Jains, because they have their own thing kind of going. They're not going to take it in this like more extreme left-hand path direction, if you will. So remember, I said karma mudra, that term, right? Action seal. But then there's the Kama Sutra, that I bet most everyone's heard of. Kama Sutra is a collection of texts about physical pleasure and how to seduce people and all of that sort of stuff. But it is about kind of almost more like a hedonistic pleasure-seeking manual, and that is not what is like Tantra is supposed to be about. So if you think that Tantra is about improving your sex life so that you can last for hours and hours on end, then you're missing the point. I mean, sure, that is like, it is important for a spiritual reason to be able to improve your ability to to retain or withhold during sex, as we'll see. But that's not like the goal. The goal isn't to make you like a better lover only or something like that. Okay? Now, let's take a look then at sex and how sex did kind of make its way into being this focal point for people with Tantra. Even going all the way back to early Upanishads, sort of this later Vedic literature, way before the time period of Tantra, you can get some quotes that make it pretty clear that you can ritualize sex. I mean, here's a famous one, right? So I'm giving you a quote here. Her vulva is the sacrificial ground. Her pubic hair is the sacred grass. her labia majora are the soma press, and her labia minora are the fire, right? Blazing at the center. A man who engages in sex with this wisdom obtains as great a world as a man who performs a soma sacrifice, and he appropriates to himself the merits of the women with whom he has sex. The women, on the other hand, appropriate to themselves the merits of a man who engages in sexual intercourse with them without this wisdom. So, a lot going on there. Pretty intense. What is being stated in this quote from the Brihadaranyaka, I think it is, Upanishad, 6.2.3, I think, or 6.4.3, yeah, that's what I think it is. So, in this text, what you're hearing is basically that the older Vedic ritual, which is, sort of elaborate fire sacrifices, there's also something with soma and pressing these plants and all that. But what's being done is they're basically taking like a ritualized sex action and equating it, right, to this more elaborate and ancient form of sacrifice that the Brahmins, right, who were masters of the Vedas, would have been doing. I mean, and they're literally, right, comparing like parts of the female anatomy to parts of the ritual sacrifice, physical sacrifice. So that's an important, I think, early text. And they're furthermore stating that like karmic merit can be transferred or shifted if one is understanding and in that proper frame of mind for sexual intercourse. But if you're not, if you're just there to have sex, like for pleasure, you're actually kind of getting screwed over, because it's claiming that, say you're a guy and you're just out there trying to have sex with someone you find beautiful, the woman is going to effectively pull some of your positive, let's say karmic, like your merit that you've earned. And really you're hurting yourself, right? If that's the case. On the flip side, if you do understand and how this is like, can be this ritualized sexual situation, you can reverse that and you could take the positive karmic merit from the female type of deal. So that's a really good quote there. Okay. Now, let's now fully shift from the ancient world to what's going on today, 20th and 21st centuries. Because what's going on today is dangerous, probably in one word. If you go and do a Google search and you put Tantra and you it's anybody's guess what you might end up with, but you're probably going to end up getting ads at some point for retreats, maybe. Hey, come on down to some other country, I don't know, a retreat space down in Mexico, and we're doing some relationship workshop, right, or love workshop, or however they might try and spin it. And unfortunately, a decent, I feel, I'm not basing this off data here, but just my own anecdotal, personal experience, I am saying that I think a good amount of these sort of workshops that exist today, especially where you need to fly somewhere else to another country with different laws, mind you, and things, are sketchy to highly dangerous on the extreme end of things, like cult, basically. Cult-like behavior where there could be some form of either sexual assault or worse yet, right, that could result, some form of trauma that could result from this. And it's a shame because it's taken something really powerful and beautiful, which are all these different ritual techniques that have been developed in India, and stripped it of the original purpose and turned it into, hey, improve your love life, but really who knows what's going to happen when you get down there. For example, how many yoga studios, or if you were to go on a retreat for this like Neo or Nava Tantra form, that's a Western product, right? How many of these are basically going to say like, you can't even come unless you have a 500-hour certification in yoga, or unless you have mastered these different forms of pranayama, like breath work and restriction, unless you understand how to use all the different bandhas or locks. It's like yogic locks, these bandhas, like a root lock, kind of a lock around the center of the chest, and then a throat lock or something. No one's saying this. Do you have proficiency in deity yoga, where you can perfectly visualize a goddess or god in your mind's eye and identify with that, interiorize that god, basically? No, very few people have that skill set who aren't part of some initiated tradition and have been practicing for decades. But there's no such thing, is what I'm getting at, right? It's like, you have $2,000, come on down, type of thing, right? And pray that all goes well for you down here, sort of deal. And that's part of why I'm making this video, is I do think that today's understanding of Tantra as just like, hey, you can have sex for 3 hours, 6 hours, or whatever you want, and you can completely control ejaculation, and everything will feel way better, whatever it is that is being pitched to people is sort of damaging. Okay, now there is truth to that piece about like this whole retention, you might call it like edging and something today, right? Of not ejaculating during the sex act. That is something that's on and off very important in India, where you don't want to lose that powerful, like power substance that is semen, say, if you're a man, right? And so sure, in some of these tantric, even ancient practices, they are concerned with not losing it. But what they're understanding in that way, if you're not ejaculating, is that you're offering up that essence, though, normally to a deity that's installed or like inside you. So it's an offering still, which makes sense, because when you're also having sex on a real like tantric understanding, you might be viewed as the male principle, all things to do with a male principle, and the female consort is all that is the goddess sort of situation. Or it might be wisdom and compassion in a perfect state of coupling, right? Attaining a non-dual form of awareness through this whole procedure. I mean, if most people trying to have sex, that's not what they're not aiming to like have a massive insight into ultimate reality, right? So even if they're concerned with lasting longer or whatever, it's more for their pleasure, not for something to like build up energies and have a proper offering, interior offering. So, but there's always been this mix too of like, do you need to retain these energies, offer it internally, or do you actually have to ejaculate and mix male and female substances like fluids and offer those physically externally like to the god or goddess, right? The tantric god or goddess. Furthermore, do you even need to ritually consume those fluids? Some texts and groups will say yes to all of these things. Some will say no to a good chunk of these things. It depends upon the time period and the place that you're at as to whether or not you would do this thing. To be fair, in China, you're going to have like Taoist sort of sexual yoga, and there's somewhat similar techniques. Even in the West, certainly later on with like Western forms of sex magic and stuff, you have all this type of material. But even ancient world in the West, a lot of people are probably not familiar with it. There's a group, a Gnostic group, arguably at least, that some of the early Christians are concerned about. This guy Epiphanius, in his book The Panarion, writes about a group, I think it's the Borborites or Archontics, one of them, can't remember, that they are celebrating the Eucharist, to go back to that example again, through the body of Christ is literally male semen mixed with female menstrual blood as the body and blood of Christ, mixed together, held up in praise, and ritually consumed. These people are believing themselves to be Christians. Now, maybe you could say, hey, that was just, an ancient sex cult type of thing run by the type of people who are just trying to take advantage of it. Maybe, right? Maybe they genuinely thought they were practicing a valid form of Christianity, though. 2,000 years ago, almost, doing this, or 1,800 years ago, or whatever. So my point is that it sounds creepy or crazy, maybe, to people, like, to even talk about sexual fluids and consuming them or whatever, but it's kind of a human nature worldwide thing. It's not just only in India at this time period, right, that they're willing to contemplate doing stuff like this. But you can, hopefully, this sounds crazy, even the stuff we're talking about. So hopefully you're already seeing like how this could become a real problem if you were at like a retreat where someone's like, hey, look, there are these texts. These are sacred texts. They do say you should do this or this. You need to be initiated, like I'm the guru, I'm the leader here, right? It's a pretty slippery slope to get yourself caught into a dangerous cult quickly. And it doesn't help that a lot of musicians, not to name names, spiritual figures of the 1960s through the early 2000s have kind of made comments about or popularized Neo-Tantra, like, again, for the wrong reasons, about, right, sexual performance and what have you. Okay? One last thing that, before I get into like my final little component here today, there is something that people have maybe never heard of in any other videos that kind of relates to all of this with the ritualized sex, and it's called Vajroli Mudra. Okay? And with Vajroli Mudra, you're either retaining, again, the loss of semen as a man, or it's sort of like a way to almost cheat a celibacy type requirement, where if you were to have sex and ejaculate you can, through the use of some of these bonded techniques, again, like you can like suck the semen, even maybe mixed with the female's fluids, like back up into you. On a physiological level, how does that work? It doesn't. That's really the truth. But these are in the text. If you wanted to jam a pipe or a tube up your urethra and stuff, like theoretically you might be able to do something like this, but it's like you're only going to pee it out later. So it's like there are a lot of fascinating, intriguing components to all of this stuff. Now, let me give my final word on all of this, okay? As someone who studied this for a while from both the philosophical, historical lens with Indian Tantra in the past and Tibet as well, or someone who has heard about through the contemporary yoga world and been exposed to some of the people that might, ads and whatever trying to get you to go to these retreats. Here's my take on a secret. Don't pay $2,000 to go fly somewhere. I'll give you at least this much. If you really want something that's going to like utilize sex but help to make it at least more spiritualized, I guess you could say, a huge problem we have, I think, in the West is that at best what's considered good sex or something would be linear, where you have multiple steps of foreplay leading up to sex and then aftercare or something like that, right? But that's a linear progress or progression, right? Across. Let's be real, most times people aren't even doing that. It's no foreplay, quick sex, no aftercare or something, right? So it's even worse. But a linear progression like that is certainly superior to not even having that, just jumping right in. But the key here is that people forget loops, feedback type loops, I guess you could say. Like, so as you're almost like climbing a pyramid here through a whole period of intimacy, things that you could do or might do at the very beginning are stopped as you then move from like foreplay to the next stage. Often there might not even be, for example, any like kissing or something might go away as a simple example. But other things that you might not even use, but like eye gazing or ritual exchange of breath between two partners, like things that would really like kind of like link you. You're not probably doing that stuff, right? But like even if you were, it would get left off as you kind of like climb up into more just the sex act itself, right? And the secret that I'm getting at here, just trying to share with you, is that by having more of a loop, feedback loop type model or viewpoint rather than a linear, you're bringing back the energies that initiated all of this stuff, right? At the beginning, back into the middle. So instead of them just like tapering off and you're just kind of like losing that, it's like compressing, intensifying if you were to reincorporate them. And like everything in all my videos, and I always talk about that a lot of these spiritual practices, West or East or anywhere else, it's like physics. It requires you to bring a certain amount of intensity and pressure, temperature, heat, right, to transform the situation into a new phase. And if you don't have that, then you're definitely not going to be able to like create a non-dual union type experience, or any sort of liberation-based experience, right? It's just not likely to happen. And I don't also believe I'm not really buying into, particularly like some of the old texts will say like you need to have someone who's initiated into Tantra as well in order to do the ritualized sex as one thing, and you need to have someone who's very young or someone who's from the lowest caste because you want to try and be like breaking these cultural taboos. I mean, granted, a lot of these texts, remember, are like hundreds to 1,000 plus years old, so things are different, but like the potential for abuse is obviously off the charts if you're suggesting that someone needs to be 15, or which is common, or that you that you meet someone who's a family member or someone who is at the lowest caste, right? Like an untouchable situation. I don't think any of that is important or relevant. I mean, I do think it matters that both people have some full like awareness of what you're attempting to do and have a basic skill level in some of the necessary like breathing mainly techniques and visualization techniques, maybe mantras, I don't know, stuff like that. Okay, so that's it for today. Looking at the old form of Tantra versus the newer form of Tantra, kind of like how classical yoga is very different than what people are doing in yoga studios. Classical Tantra is almost totally different than what people are trying to do today. Okay? So all the more important reason here to stick with my typical sign-off, right? And be wary of what some people are claiming, and stay gray.